Hey class, today we're going to talk about how a bill becomes a law at the national legislative level. And we're going to follow a sample bill through the entirety of the process, assuming that this bill passes every level to get to the president for consideration and signature. I want to hasten to tell you that not every bill goes through that, is that successful. In fact, the vast majority of bills die at some point within this process, but we'll talk about that more as we go. So let's begin. Our bill is going to be titled House Resolution 911. It'll have been introduced by Brad Schneider, our local congressman, and this will be a bill that requires all automobiles to drive on the left side of the road. So switching from the right-hand side to the left-hand side of the road, and all of the impact that would have throughout our transportation network. That bill is introduced by Brad Schneider. It would proceed to assignment for a committee. After the bill is introduced, it would be assigned to a standing committee. We've already talked about standing committees. These are the committees that hear and consider legislation. And it would be assigned to a standing committee based on its subject matter. So the subject matter is what the bill's all about. This bill being about cars driving on what side of the road would presumably be assigned to the Transportation Committee. Okay. Once in committee, the bill would be assigned to a subcommittee. So this bill would be assigned to some subcommittee dealing with roads and surface transportation. And at the subcommittee level, the bill would be studied by the members. In this case, the congressmen and women that were assigned to that subcommittee. Remember that the congressmen and women that are assigned to these committees become experts in their area of study. So they're going to have contacts with people that would discuss the benefits and negatives associated with changing, for example, what side of the road cars drove on. They would review documents. They'd examine the evidence of the problem that this bill would be trying to fix. And then they'd hold hearings and they'd ask questions of experts, people who are in favor of this change, people who are opposed to this change. And they would discuss amongst themselves and ask lots of questions, argue a lot, and then offer amendments or changes to the bills to try to make them better or to somehow tweak something that comes out of the expert testimony. And then they'd hold a vote. Does the bill succeed? If it succeeds, it's voted out of subcommittee to the full committee, in this case, the full Transportation Committee. If they don't vote it out, the bill dies in the subcommittee. Now, at the full committee level, the exact process happens again, except it's happening for the entire committee. Remember, a subcommittee is just a small group of the members that are on the committee who are meeting to discuss this bill. Consequently, the entirety of the committee would need to hear all of the expert testimony. They'd have to review documents for themselves. They'd want to offer amendments maybe, and you go through the entire process again. Ultimately, following a full committee vote, if yes, the bill would proceed to the House floor by way of the Rules Committee, and if not, the bill dies. Now, here's the interesting thing. Most bills die in committee. The vast majority of legislation dies in committee. Something north of 80%, more than 80% of bills die in committee. I'm going to show you a example of, or not an example, but an image of this process right now. These are, every one of these dots are legislation that were introduced in the 2015-2016 Congress, and these marks over here are the senators and representatives who introduced that legislation. And these are committees in the Senate, committees in the House, and then as these bills pass one particular chamber or the other, they go over to the other chamber for consideration. If they make it to the president's desk, they become law, whether they're signed, vetoed, or overridden. So here we go. This is over the course of a 2-year period, the 114th Congress. All these dots are individual bills being introduced and being assigned to committees. And you see as they fly across from one chamber to another, they go through a hearing process, and this is a time-lapse process. There were over 10,000 bills introduced in the 2015-2016 Congress. And as you can see, most of the bills are stuck in committees. See, all these bills jammed up in all of these committees. Every one of them is a piece of legislation, and not a lot of bills become law. Okay? A total of 10,153 bills were introduced, 3,800 or so on the Senate side, about 6,700 on the House side, but that's how many become law. Okay? That's only about 220, or roughly 2% of bills become law. The vast majority get hung up in committee. Now, committees go from, a piece of legislation would go from the standing committee to the rules committee, and the rule is set for the bill, just like we talked about in the committee process. In the House, that governs the floor action for the bill, how long are debates going to be, how many amendments are going to be considered, and that they also set the calendar of debate, the order of bills that they're going to be heard in. Privilege bills are taken out of order because the Speaker of the House wants it that way. Whenever the Speaker wants, the Speaker gets. So privilege bills are a thing as well. Now, what does floor action look like? Well, you've got 435 members that need to be educated about this piece of legislation before they can vote on it. So you have more debate. Each political party gets a certain amount of time to speak on the bill. The people doing the talking are more likely than not the people from the committee who want to explain to their colleagues why this bill should be passed. There might be floor amendments offered based on the rule from the House Rules Committee, which of course would be changes to the bill proposed during debate. And again, another opportunity for the bill to either pass, in this case it would go to the other chamber, the Senate, or die. The bill might die because it doesn't get a majority vote. Please remember that all bills could start in the Senate just as easily as they start in the House. Okay? There's no requirement for them to start in the House. But let's say this bill passes and proceeds to the second chamber, in this case the U.S. Senate, for consideration. In our example, our bill goes to the Senate, and it's given a Senate number, Senate 911. The bill is assigned to a standing committee. Assuming there were no amendments to the bill in subcommittee, committee, or on the floor, our bill would probably be assigned to the Transportation Committee again, the Senate Transportation Committee, where it would be considered in the subcommittee action. It would go through the entire process again, just like at the House level. The bill would be referred to subcommittee. It would be studied more. They'd have hearings on it. Proponents, opponents, experts would talk about the idea, offer amendments, and then vote on the bill again in the Senate committee. If a yes vote, the bill would proceed to the full committee. If a no vote, the bill dies. And then the full committee would do the exact same thing. They'd hold hearings. They'd have experts and proponents and opponents, and they would offer amendments to the bill. And they'd take a vote too if the bill made it that far. If yes, the bill would proceed to the Senate floor. If no, the bill dies again. Now, at this point, there's no Rules Committee in the Senate, as you well know. So Senate leadership would say, yes, we like this bill, or no, we don't like this bill. They'd take a position on the bill for or against, but that's all they'd do. Remember, we talked about this idea that individual senators have a lot more power relative to their House colleagues. They're a lot more independent. So the leadership would say, hey, we think you should vote for this or not. And in most cases, the senators would do what they think is best for their state. Senate debate is different than in the House. There are no limitations on how long a senator can speak. Thus, a filibuster is possible. A U.S. senator, one U.S. senator, can stop up the entire process on legislation. They can talk a bill to death. the purpose is to assure that the political minority's viewpoints is being considered, okay? Because you don't want a tyranny of the majority like what you can sometimes see in the House of Representatives, where if you have a majority, you have the power. It's supposed to lead to compromise. It usually doesn't, but it's supposed to lead to compromise. Now, closing off that debate, closing off that filibuster is called cloture. Okay, you can think of it as cloture. That requires 60 votes or 3/5 majority in the Senate. Now, actually voting, taking a cloture vote is relatively rare. Actually, holding a filibuster is pretty rare. Just the threat of a filibuster is usually enough to shut down a piece of legislation. And in that case, the bill dies. Okay, now this clip right here, this filibuster clip, I highly recommend you watch. It is of Rand Paul doing a filibuster for about 11.5 hours. It's a good one. It's pretty funny. I mean, it's poking a little bit of fun at the funny things that somebody says over the course of 11 hours. But it makes the point that an individual senator can stop everything so that their issues are addressed by the majority. Now, let's say the filibuster doesn't happen on our bill and it proceeds to an up or down vote. Well, if yes, if the Senate vote is a yes, and there's no revisions, no changes in the Senate, the bill goes right to the president. But if there were amendments offered at the subcommittee level in the Senate, the full committee level, or on the Senate floor, if the bill's been changed in any way since how it was introduced from the House, the bill then has to go to a conference committee. We'll talk about conference committees here in a second. If no, the bill dies. If it's a no vote, if it doesn't get a majority vote, it dies. So what's a conference committee? Well, a conference committee is not a legislative committee. It is not one of those committees we talked about as a legislative committee, standing, select, or special, joint, or the rules committee. This is an ad hoc committee. The Constitution requires all legislation passed by both chambers to be identical so that when it goes to the president knows exactly what the law is being proposed by the legislature. So the conference committee needs to resolve any differences that exist between the House bill and the Senate bill. Now, again, this is an ad hoc committee. It's just brought together for this purpose, to resolve any conflicts. Usually it's the senior members from the House and the Senate standing committees that get together and work out the differences. They got to have one public meeting, and they negotiate to either the death of the bill, because they couldn't resolve the differences, or a conference committee report. And a conference committee report, or a CCR, is just a majority of the members from the committee, from this ad hoc committee, coming together saying, okay, here's how we resolve the differences. Both, the Senate says we're going to do this. The House says we'll drop that. So the bill language is identical. And if a conference committee report is agreed to, the CCR goes to the House and the Senate, and the entire House and Senate vote to approve that conference committee report as the legislation that is going to go to the president. If both chambers vote yes, the bill goes straight to the president. If no, the bill dies. And that brings us to the check and balance on the power of the legislature, which is the president. The president can sign a bill and it becomes law, or can veto a bill, and then that bill goes back to both chambers, and they got to see if they want to override the bill, the president's veto. You need 2/3 majorities in each chamber to override a veto. Doesn't happen very often. Now, the president also could exercise a pocket veto. The Constitution says the president has to veto a bill within 10 days of receipt, excluding Sundays. So if no action occurs on the bill and Congress is still in session, then the bill becomes law automatically without the president's signature. If the president doesn't take an action on the bill and Congress has adjourned, has left session, well, then the bill dies. That's the exercise of the pocket veto. Please don't forget to fill out the Google Classroom form. Post any questions you have about this process. Answer the questions on the Google form, and I will see you in class.